I was standing at the business class check-in counter at JFK, holding 3 tickets for the luxury river cruise along the Rhine that I had drained $500,000 to arrange. Right at that moment, my phone buzzed. A text from Serena, my own little girl, said, "Dad, this trip is family only. Damien says you've been so gloomy lately and he doesn't want the mood ruined. Just stay home. We'll use your ticket for Damien's parents instead." One text, a few cold lines, kicked off a trip I had paid for myself to make room for people who hadn't spent a single cent. But you know what's insane? I didn't turn around and drive home to cry. I smiled at the airline agent, canceled every single upgrade on their tickets, kept my own VIP suite intact, and quietly boarded that same ship. What they plan to do to me after this trip will chill you to the bone, but the perfect trap I laid waiting for them at the finish line was an absolute masterpiece. Before we get into how a father's devotion twisted into the cruelest checkmate in family history, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the most dramatic stories on this channel. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? My name is Leland Foss. I am 62 years old, a retired architect, and until 3 months ago I believed, with my whole chest, that I had raised a daughter who loved me for who I was and not for what I could give her. That belief died at Gate 7 of JFK International, and I want to tell you exactly how it happened, because I promise you the ending is nothing like what you're expecting. 26 hours before my phone buzzed with the text that would change everything, I was standing in my bedroom in Westchester, carefully folding the navy linen shirt my late wife Marion had bought me for a 30th anniversary trip that never happened. Marion died 4 years ago, 11 months before we were supposed to board a river cruise down the Rhine, a trip we had been saving for since Serena was still in diapers, since we used to sit on the back porch with a road atlas open across our knees, tracing the river with our fingers, and inventing towns we'd never actually visit. I had kept that promise alive in a drawer full of brochures for 4 years, running my thumb over pictures of castles neither of us ever saw together, telling myself that someday I would take our daughter down that same river, past those same vineyards, and hand her the trip her mother never got to take. This spring, I finally did it. I booked the entire 14-day luxury river cruise myself, a presidential suite for me, 2 deluxe balcony suites for Serena and Damien, and for Damien's parents, private excursions arranged in Cologne, Strasbourg, and Basel, and a wine tasting I set up personally through a sommelier I'd been emailing for weeks. The total came to just under $500,000, and I did not blink once while I typed my card number into that booking portal, because for the first time since Marion's funeral, I felt like I was doing something that actually mattered, something that would put color back into a family that had gone gray without her. That wasn't the only check I'd written that year. 6 months earlier, my son-in-law, Damien Lockhart, had sat across from me at my own kitchen table with a laptop open to a pitch deck for something called Bellwether Ventures, a real estate technology startup he swore was going to disrupt commercial leasing within 18 months. He needed $1.5 million to get past what he called the Valley of Death before his Series A round closed. So I mortgaged the house Marion and I had built with our own hands, the house where I had carried Serena over the threshold as a newborn, the house where Marion's ashes still sat on the mantel, and I wired every cent of it into my son-in-law's company account. Damien hugged me afterward, right there at that same table. He told me I was more than a father-in-law to him. He called me a partner, a founder, family in the truest sense of the word. I believed him, because I wanted to believe him, and because believing him meant I still had a family that needed me for something other than my checkbook. I was thinking about none of that ugliness when I zipped my suitcase shut on the morning of our flight. I was thinking about the way the afternoon light would hit the Rhine Gorge near Bacharach, about the bottle of Riesling I'd already arranged to have chilling in Serena's cabin as a surprise, about finally getting to watch my daughter fall in love with the trip her mother and I had dreamed up on a rented balcony back in 1994. My driver picked me up at 4 in the morning while the street outside my house was still dark and quiet. I had 3 boarding passes in the inside pocket of my jacket, mine, Serena's, and Damien's, printed and folded the night before, like a man carrying good news he couldn't wait to deliver in person. The business class check-in line at JFK moved slowly, even at that hour, and I remember standing there, with my carry-on between my feet, running my thumb over the edge of those boarding passes just to feel that they were real, that this trip was actually happening after 4 years of only imagining it. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I assumed it was Serena, confirming what gate to meet at, or maybe complaining that Damien had packed too many bags again, the way he always did on every trip we'd ever taken together. I pulled the phone out smiling. The message was from Serena. It said, "Dad, this trip is family only. Damien says you've been so gloomy lately, and he doesn't want the mood ruined. Just stay home. We'll use your ticket for Damien's parents instead." I read it once. I read it a second time, standing perfectly still while the line moved forward without me, and a woman behind me cleared her throat impatiently. I read it a third time, waiting for the words to somehow rearrange themselves into something that made sense, the way you wait for a bad dream to end on its own if you just hold still long enough. Family only, as if I were some outside vendor who had overstayed his welcome at a party he'd paid to throw. As if the man who had spent 4 years grieving a promise into existence, who had just mortgaged his own house for this family, wasn't family enough to board a ship he had personally chartered from the very first suite to the very last life vest. Something happened inside my chest in that moment that I still find difficult to put into words. It wasn't the sharp, hot pain I would have expected. It was colder than that, a kind of freezing clarity, the exact sensation of ice water replacing blood in your veins, one vessel at a time. I looked down at those 3 boarding passes in my trembling hand and understood, all at once and completely, what I actually was to my daughter and her husband. Not a father, a line of credit with a pulse, an automated teller machine that occasionally required the courtesy of a birthday card and a phone call on Father's Day. I did not cry. I did not call Serena screaming into the phone, the way some men would have, right there in front of 100 strangers. I did not turn around, walk back out through the sliding doors of Terminal 4, and drive home to sit alone in a dark kitchen, feeling sorry for myself while the suitcase sat unpacked by the door for a week. Instead, I smiled, an actual, genuine smile, the kind that surprised even me, at the gate agent standing in front of me, a young man named Isaiah, whose name tag I still remember to this day, and I asked him very calmly whether he could connect me to the cruise line's VIP concierge desk before I boarded my connecting flight to Amsterdam. What happened over the next 40 minutes was the first move in a game my daughter and her husband didn't yet know they were playing. I identified myself as the account holder and primary billing contact for all 3 reservations under the Foss party. I explained in the same even businesslike tone I used to use when firing subcontractors who'd cut corners on a job site that there had been a last-minute change to the guest list. Damien's parents, Roland and Dolores Lockhart, would be joining the voyage in place of myself. Fine. But I was still the man who had paid for every square foot of that ship, and I intended to exercise every right that came with that fact. I downgraded both reservations, Serena and Damien's suite, and the one meant for Roland and Dolores, from deluxe balcony suites all the way down to the 2 cheapest interior cabins available, windowless rooms on the lowest deck, directly beside the engine room, where the concierge herself warned me the vibration and noise could be noticeable throughout the entire voyage. I canceled every specialty dining package, every private excursion, every bottle of wine I had pre-ordered for their rooms weeks in advance. I kept my own presidential suite exactly as it was. Top deck, private wraparound balcony, a butler on call around the clock, and I paid the price difference in full, without asking a single question. Then I made one final deliberate request. I asked the concierge by name to make absolutely certain that under no circumstances was my identity as the primary account holder to be disclosed to any other guest in the Foss-Lockhart party. As far as my daughter would know, some anonymous benefactor had simply failed to show up at check-in, and someone in accounting had quietly reshuffled the cabins without explanation. I boarded my flight to Amsterdam with a strange, unfamiliar lightness sitting in my chest, the kind of lightness I hadn't felt since long before Marion got sick. 2 days later, I stood on the top deck of that ship in a linen jacket, a glass of champagne sweating in my hand, and watched from 40 feet above as my daughter, my son-in-law, and his parents dragged their luggage down a narrow interior corridor toward a cabin that already smelled faintly of diesel fuel. Serena didn't look up once. She had no idea her own father was standing directly above her in the golden evening light, watching the very first move of a game she didn't even know had already begun. For the first 5 days of that cruise, I became something like a ghost, haunting my own family's vacation. I ate my breakfast alone on my private balcony, high above the waterline, watching the vineyards of the Middle Rhine slide past in the morning fog, terraced hillsides stitched together with stone walls that had probably stood there since before my own grandfather was born. I took my meals in the specialty restaurant reserved for suite guests, where the staff had been instructed, at my quiet request, to seat me at a corner table facing away from the main dining room. I wore sunglasses on deck even when the sky was overcast, and every single day, at least twice, I found some quiet reason to walk past the lower deck where my daughter and son-in-law were staying, just to watch them from a distance, the way you'd watch strangers in a nature documentary. Curious, detached, and slowly, methodically collecting evidence. What I saw in those 5 days confirmed something I had already begun to suspect back at that airport gate, though I hadn't yet let myself say it out loud, even inside my own head. This wasn't a single cruel text sent in a moment of thoughtlessness. This was a pattern. This was who they had become, and possibly who they had always been, while I was simply too busy loving them to notice. On the second day in the port city of Cologne, I watched from across a cobblestone plaza as Serena and Damien tried to purchase a pair of matching designer watches at a boutique jewelry shop near the cathedral, the kind of purchase 2 young people make when they want to feel like the trip belongs to them and not to the man who paid for it. I watched Damien's face go from confident to confused to furious as the shop clerk apologetically explained, in careful English, that the card had been declined. I had frozen it 2 days earlier, quietly, through a banking app on my own phone, the same authorized user card I had given Serena years ago when she was 22, and trying to build her own credit history, a card I had never once questioned or restricted in 8 years. Until now. I watched my daughter storm out of that boutique with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and I felt something inside me that I am not proud of, and will not pretend I didn't feel. A cold, clean satisfaction, like the first sip of ice water on a brutally hot day. On the third day at dinner, I watched Damien's parents, Roland and Dolores Lockhart, complain loudly enough for half the dining room to hear about the cheap little closet they'd been assigned near the engine room, about the constant low hum of machinery that kept Dolores awake at night, about how someone must have made a mistake with the reservation. Serena apologized to them over and over, visibly mortified, promising she would get to the bottom of it with the cruise line's front desk. She had absolutely no idea that the mistake sitting 3 tables away, sipping a glass of Riesling in a linen jacket, was her own father, watching her grovel to in-laws who had never once, in 3 years of marriage, contributed a single dollar to anything that mattered. But it was the 4th night, day 4 of the cruise, somewhere on the black water between Rudesheim and Koblenz, when everything I thought I understood about my daughter's marriage got torn open completely, and what I found underneath was so much colder than a cruel text message that I had to sit with it in silence for a full hour before I could even move my own body. I had gone up to the ship's quiet observation lounge near midnight, unable to sleep, and taken a seat in a high-backed leather armchair tucked into an alcove near the bar, mostly hidden by a decorative wall of dark wood paneling. I wasn't hiding on purpose. I simply hadn't announced myself to the two bartenders closing out the register. And so when Damien and Serena walked into that same lounge 15 minutes later, clearly believing they were alone, clearly a few drinks deep into an argument that had started somewhere else on the ship, they had no idea I was sitting less than 20 feet away, perfectly still, listening to every single word. He brought the folder, Serena. I checked his carry-on when he wasn't looking, back at the house, weeks before we left. It's exactly what I told you it would be. Damien's voice was low, urgent, the voice of a man laying out a plan he'd rehearsed many times in his own head, maybe even in a mirror. The medical power of attorney, the financial power of attorney, the whole durable package, notarized and ready to go. Your father actually brought it with him, like I knew he would, because that's what he does. He plans everything. He prepares for every contingency. That's his entire personality, and it's going to be the thing that finally works in our favor for once. I still don't fully understand why we need all of it right now, Serena said, and there was something in her voice that I desperately, achingly wanted to believe was hesitation, was conscience, was my own daughter's soul pushing back against whatever it was her husband was quietly proposing to her in the dark. Because this is the trip, Serena. This is the setup. We get him relaxed out here on the water, away from his lawyer, away from anyone who could talk him out of it. We get a few good bottles of wine into him over the next several days. We tell him it's just routine paperwork, that every reasonable person his age carries these documents when they travel internationally in case anything happens. It's completely normal. Nobody will question it, not even him. He signs. And then when we're back in the States, I take that signed power of attorney straight to Dr. Whitfield, who already owes me a favor from the loan I helped arrange for his surgical center 2 years ago. Whitfield writes up a cognitive evaluation. Early-stage dementia, memory lapses, executive function decline. It doesn't even need to be true, Serena. It just needs to be plausible enough for a judge to sign off on conservatorship. Bellwether Ventures needs that second round of funding by the fall, or we're completely finished. And the only asset large enough to leverage is what's still sitting in your father's name. The house, the remaining equity, all of it. I sat frozen in that leather chair with my heart slamming against my ribs so hard I was certain they would somehow hear it over the low, constant hum of the ship's engines beneath us. Then Serena said the words that I will carry with me, unchanged, word for word, until the day I finally die. He's going to end up in a home eventually anyway, Damien. He's 62. He's alone since Mom passed. He barely leaves that house except to go putter around his old job sites like some kind of ghost. This way we actually control the timeline instead of waiting around for years for him to fall down some stairs and do it the hard, expensive way. We need that capital now, not in 10 years when it's finally too late to save the company. We need that capital. Not, is this the right thing to do? Not, is there any other way? My own daughter, the child I had carried on my shoulders through every county fair in Westchester, the girl I had walked down an aisle at a wedding that cost me $42,000, had just calmly, rationally weighed her father's freedom and dignity against a startup's quarterly cash flow projections and found her own father wanting. I don't remember standing up from that chair. I don't remember the walk back to my suite, or unlocking the door, or sitting down on the edge of that enormous bed in the dark with the lights of some sleeping German town drifting slowly past my window. What I do remember is the exact moment the grief in my chest, the raw, animal grief of hearing your own child discuss your disposal like a line item on a spreadsheet, finally burned itself out completely and left something else behind in its place. Not sadness anymore, something far sharper. something that had been a working architect for 35 years, that had spent an entire career solving problems other people swore couldn't be solved, and that was now, for the first time in this entire ordeal, wide awake, perfectly calm, and thinking with absolute clarity. If they wanted a plan, I decided, sitting there alone in the dark with my hands folded in my lap, then I was going to give them the single best design plan of my entire career. I made my decision that same night, sitting alone in the dark of my suite, with the lights of some sleeping German town drifting past my window, and by the time the sun came up over the river the next morning, I'd already spoken twice by satellite phone with Terence Bishop, the trust attorney who had handled Marion's estate and mine for 11 years. What I asked him to do would take 4 full days to complete properly, working across 2 time zones with a legal team back in New York. And every single one of those 4 days I spent playing the most difficult role of my entire life, the role of a broken, lonely old man, desperate for his daughter's love, exactly as gullible and pliable as Damien Lockhart needed me to be. On the 5th evening of the cruise, I chose to reveal myself. I walked into the ship's most exclusive specialty restaurant at 8 o'clock sharp, wearing the same navy linen shirt Marion had bought me for our anniversary, and I asked the maitre d' to seat me at the empty chair directly beside my daughter's table, a table my own money had already quietly upgraded that afternoon, reservation and all, without anyone sitting at it knowing why the wine suddenly arrived a full grade nicer than they'd actually ordered. Serena looked up first. I watched every drop of color drain out of her face in real time, watched her fork freeze halfway to her mouth, watched her eyes dart to Damien, and then back to me, as if she were checking whether this was actually happening or whether she'd simply had 1 glass of wine too many. "Dad?" she said, and her voice cracked on the single syllable. "What? How are you even here? You didn't—" "I've been here the whole time, sweetheart," I said gently, folding my hands on the white tablecloth like a man with nothing at all to hide. "Since the very first day. I suppose there was some kind of mix-up with the cabin assignments back at check-in. I only just found out this evening that you all were on board too." It was, of course, a complete fabrication, and I delivered it with the same steady, unhurried calm I once used to tell nervous clients that a foundation crack was nothing to worry about, right before I quietly ordered the entire slab re-poured behind their backs. Damien recovered fast, faster than I expected, honestly, which told me everything I needed to know about how many times in his life he'd already had to talk his way out of a corner. Within 30 seconds he was on his feet, pumping my hand, apologizing for the confusion, insisting his parents had simply been penciled in at the last minute because of some scheduling conflict back home, promising this was all some terrible misunderstanding that the 4 of us would laugh about together someday, maybe even at next year's Thanksgiving. Roland and Dolores Lockhart, to their credit, at least had the decency to look uncomfortable, staring hard at their bread plates. I let them believe every word of it. I let Damien refill my wine glass himself, watched him do it with his own hand shaking slightly at the neck of the bottle, and I played my part flawlessly, better than I had ever played anything in 35 years of client meetings and contract negotiations. I told them how lonely I had felt since Marion passed, how quiet the house had become, how the silence sometimes felt like its own kind of weather. I told them how much I missed being needed, being included, being wanted at the table instead of merely tolerated at the edge of it. I let my voice go thin and unsteady in exactly the places a genuinely heartbroken 62-year-old man's voice would go thin and unsteady. And I watched Damien's eyes light up with something that looked unmistakably like relief. The particular relief of a predator realizing his prey had simply wandered back into range on its own, entirely by choice. By the 7th night, Damien made his move, exactly as he and Serena had rehearsed in that observation lounge 4 nights earlier, except now I already knew every single line of the script before he even opened his mouth to speak it. He invited me to his cabin, upgraded now at my own quiet, anonymous expense, though he'd never once think to ask why the room suddenly had a window, for what he called a nightcap between family. He poured the wine generously, refilling my glass twice before I'd finished the first, laughing warmly at old stories I told him about Marion, about the house, about how tired I was of managing everything alone at my age, with no one to share the weight of it. Somewhere around midnight, with a genuinely convincing display of reluctance, he slid a slim leather folder across the small cabin table and explained gently, patiently, that it was simply smart planning, a durable power of attorney covering both medical and financial decisions, standard paperwork, the kind any responsible family puts in place for an aging parent traveling internationally. Nothing more than that. Nothing to worry about at all. I looked at that folder for a long, deliberate moment. I let my hand tremble, just slightly, as I reached for the pen he offered me across the table. And then, with my son-in-law leaning forward in his chair, barely able to contain himself, I signed it. But I did not sign it the way I have signed every legal document of my adult life. Years earlier, after a bitter dispute with a former business partner who'd once tried to force my hand on a contract I never should have touched, Terence Bishop and I had put a private safeguard in place, one buried so deep in my estate planning that even Marion never fully knew the details of it. I had a second signature registered exclusively with my attorney's office, a specific, deliberate variation in the loop of the L and the slant of the final S that existed for exactly one purpose in the world: to be used only under duress, only when I was being coerced, manipulated, or cornered into signing something against my true famille. Any document bearing that particular signature was, by prior legal agreement filed with my attorney and witnessed years earlier, automatically null and void the moment it was executed, regardless of what it claimed to grant or transfer. I used that signature that night, in a slightly swaying cabin, under the warm yellow light of a single reading lamp, with my son-in-law watching my hand move across the page with badly concealed excitement. What Damien didn't know, what he had absolutely no way of knowing, sitting there congratulating himself on a plan 4 months in the making, was that the assets described in that folder no longer legally existed in my name at all. The night before, using the ship's satellite internet connection at 2 a.m, while the rest of the vessel slept around me, I had worked with Terence and a full legal team back in New York to complete the transfer of everything I owned: the house, my remaining savings, my retirement accounts, even my own modest ownership stake in Bellwether Ventures itself, into an irrevocable trust. I was no longer on paper the owner of a single one of those assets. The trust was. And a durable power of attorney signed over a man's personal property is worth exactly nothing at all when that man no longer owns any personal property left to control. Damien Lockhart sat across that small table from me, grinning, carefully folding my signed, worthless, legally void power of attorney back into its leather folder as though he were holding the deed to my entire life in his hands. He had absolutely no idea he was holding a piece of paper with no more legal weight than a cocktail napkin from the ship's bar. I smiled at him, raised my glass, and told him I felt lighter already, now that the family paperwork was finally settled between us. He clinked his glass against mine and told me he was proud of me for finally being smart about the future at my age. I have never, in 62 years on this earth, wanted so badly to laugh directly in another human being's face. I stayed another 20 minutes in that cabin, listening to Damien talk about the second funding round he was already planning to close with this signature in hand, watching him sketch numbers on a cocktail napkin like a man drawing up the blueprints of his own future mansion. I nodded along at every figure. I told him I trusted him completely, and when I finally stood to leave, he actually hugged me at the door, the same warm, practiced hug he'd given me at my own kitchen table 6 months earlier, right before I wired him $1.5 million I would never fully get back. This time, Standing in that narrow cabin hallway with the folder still in his hand, I hugged him back just as tightly, and I meant every ounce of the coldness underneath it. Pride is a strange thing to watch from the outside, especially when it belongs to someone who believes he has just outsmarted you. For the final 6 days of that cruise, I watched Damien Lockhart walk around the ship like a man who had already won something enormous, like the trip itself was simply a formality he was waiting to get through before the real celebration could begin. He ordered better bottles of wine at dinner, waving away the price without looking at it. He started talking louder in the hallways, laughing more easily, clapping strangers on the shoulder at the bar like a man practicing for a future he already considered guaranteed. He stopped even pretending to check with me before making plans, the same way a man stops locking a door he believes he already owns the only key to. The moment the ship docked in Basel, on our final morning on the water, Damien made exactly the move I had been quietly waiting for him to make since the night he'd handed me that pen in his cabin. I learned the specific details later, piece by piece, through Terence Bishop and through a contact of his who worked in compliance at a venture capital fund called Highgate Ventures, a mid-sized aggressive fund out of San Francisco, known throughout the industry for moving fast on early-stage deals and asking very few questions when the collateral looked solid on paper. Within hours of stepping off that ship onto German soil, still jet-lagged and giddy with what he genuinely believed was a guaranteed inheritance sitting in his back pocket, Damien sent an email to a partner at Highgate named Sloan Kirby. Attached to that email was a scanned copy of my signature, my duress signature, the one that voided everything it touched, along with a summary document claiming that the personal assets of one Leland Foss, including a fully paid-off residential property in Westchester, valued at just under $2 million, now stood as personal guarantee behind whatever bridge loan Bellwether Ventures needed to secure before its runway ran out completely. $3 million, wired quickly, meant to carry his failing startup across the gap until a Series A round he'd been promising his own board of directors for 8 straight months finally closed, if it ever actually would have. Bellwether Ventures, I would later learn from the same compliance contact, had burned through nearly all of my original $1.5 million in less than 5 months on office space in a converted warehouse, a marketing budget that produced almost nothing measurable, and salaries for engineers who had already quietly started interviewing elsewhere. He wasn't simply borrowing against a lie, he was building an entire second scheme on top of the first one, planning to use that $3 million to seize outright legal control of my house through some mechanism his own outside counsel had apparently already drawn up in advance. A mechanism that, had my signature actually been valid, would have made me personally and legally liable for every single cent of that loan the moment his company inevitably defaulted, which every honest projection of Bellwether's finances suggested it eventually would, and probably sooner rather than later. He thought he was setting a trap that would collect from me twice, once through the forged power of attorney, and again through a loan I never agreed to guarantee, using assets that legally belonged to nobody named Damien Lockhart at all, and had not belonged to me on paper for nearly a full week. What Damien did not understand, sitting in some Basel hotel room typing that email with what I can only imagine was tremendous, giddy self-satisfaction, was that he was no longer negotiating with a grieving old man desperate to be loved by his own family. He was negotiating, entirely without his own knowledge, against Terence Bishop, a trust and estate attorney who had spent 11 years building an ironclad structure around everything I owned, and against a version of myself that had been sharpened rather than softened by everything I had overheard in that observation lounge 4 nights earlier. The moment Terence's compliance contact at Highgate Ventures flagged the incoming loan request for standard review, routine procedure for any collateral involving a named individual rather than the borrowing company itself, Terence made a single, unhurried phone call on my behalf. He did not threaten anyone. He did not raise his voice even once. He simply explained calmly and with full documentation already assembled and ready to send that the residential property listed as collateral had been irrevocably transferred out of Leland Foss's personal ownership 4 days earlier, that the signature on the attached power of attorney had been executed under a legally registered duress protocol rendering the entire document void from the exact moment of signing, and that Highgate Ventures might want to examine very carefully what exactly Damien Lockhart had represented to them as verified fact. Sloane Kirby, it turned out, took fraud extremely seriously, particularly the kind that involved wiring $3 million across state lines based on falsified collateral documents and a forged guarantee. Within 48 hours, Highgate Ventures' internal counsel had filed a formal report with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and flagged the entire transaction with the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Division, citing what their own attorneys described in writing as clear evidence of attempted wire fraud and the interstate transmission of falsified financial instruments, federal charges, the kind that don't quietly disappear with a good lawyer and an apology letter, the kind that follow a man for the rest of his professional life, no matter how many boardrooms he tries to talk his way back into. Damien Lockhart believed, right up until the moment federal investigators began building their case file, that he had successfully trapped his father-in-law between a forged signature and a guaranteed loan he'd never see the consequences of. In reality, he had spent one careless afternoon in a Basel hotel room tightening a noose around his own neck at the federal level, using his own name, his own email address, and his own company letterhead, while I sat 2 floors above him on that same ship's final night, thoroughly enjoying a glass of Riesling I hadn't paid full attention to in years. I spent the last 2 days of that voyage the way I imagine a man is meant to spend the final days of an expensive vacation. Slowly, gratefully, without checking my phone every 10 minutes, the way I had for the entire first week. I sat on my private balcony and watched the last of the terraced vineyards give way to the flatter, wider water near the Swiss border. I ordered the 7-course wine pairing menu I had originally planned for Serena and me to share together, and I drank it alone, toasting quietly to Marion, telling her out loud, like a fool talking to an empty balcony, that her promise had finally been kept, just not in any way either of us could ever have imagined back on that rented porch in 1994. Meanwhile, down on the lower decks, my daughter and her husband spent those same final 2 days celebrating. I watched them from a distance one last time on our final evening aboard, Damien ordering champagne he still could not technically afford, Serena laughing with her head thrown back at some joke Dolores had made, Roland raising a toast to new beginnings and smart family investments, while the rest of the table clinked glasses in agreement. They had no idea they were toasting a lit fuse. They had no idea that somewhere, in a federal building in San Francisco, a case file bearing Damien Lockhart's full legal name had already been opened, and that the countdown on their entire fabricated future had already, quietly, irreversibly, begun ticking down toward zero. I remember standing at the railing that final night, watching the lights of a small Swiss town blur past on the dark water, and feeling something I had not expected to feel at all in the middle of what should have been the coldest, most calculated week of my entire life. I felt sorry for them just for a moment, not sorry enough to warn them, not sorry enough to reach for my phone and undo a single thing I had already set in motion. But sorry the way you feel, sorry watching a car run a red light in the distance, already knowing exactly what's coming and understanding with complete certainty that there is nothing left to do now but watch it happen. We landed back at JFK on a gray Tuesday morning, exactly 14 days after I had stood at that same check-in counter holding 3 boarding passes like a man carrying good news he couldn't wait to deliver. Serena and Damien walked off the jet bridge ahead of me, tanned and rested, already talking in low, excited voices about tomorrow morning and getting Dad in front of someone who can actually document this properly, in writing, with a real letterhead. I caught just enough of it, trailing a few steps behind with my carry-on rolling quietly over the tile, to understand exactly who they meant. A doctor. A psychiatric evaluation, quiet and clinical, scheduled as early as the following day, meant to start building the paper trail Damien still believed he needed on top of the signature he thought he already held safely in his briefcase. They had no idea that paper trail was already worthless. They had no idea, in fact, that they were flying home not into a fresh start funded by their aging father-in-law's misfortune, but directly into the middle of a federal criminal investigation with Damien Lockhart's own name printed across the top of every single document in the file. I let them get ahead of me at baggage claim on purpose. I wanted to see what came next with my own eyes, from a careful distance, the way I had watched so much of this entire ordeal unfold from a careful, deliberate distance for 2 straight weeks. Terence Bishop had arranged everything down to the minute, and I trusted him the way I once trusted the steel and concrete calculations stamped on my own blueprints, completely, without hesitation, because the math had already been checked twice by people whose entire careers depended on getting it right. Damien's first stop after collecting his luggage wasn't home. It was his own office, the glass-walled Bellwether Ventures headquarters he'd been so proud to show me on a video call 8 months earlier, the one he swore would be worth 10 times what you put in within 18 months, maybe less. He wanted to walk in triumphant, I imagine, fresh off a European vacation with a signed power of attorney tucked into his briefcase and a bridge loan he assumed was already moving smoothly through underwriting. He wanted his own employees, the ones who hadn't been paid a real bonus in over a year, to watch him arrive like a man who had just secured the company's entire future in one clean stroke. What was waiting for him instead, according to the security footage Terence later obtained through the ongoing investigation, was not his staff at all. It was 2 federal agents from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, standing calmly beside a 3rd investigator from the Internal Revenue Service, all 3 of them holding the exact same folder of documents Terence had personally couriered to their office 9 days earlier, back while we were still somewhere on the water between Basel and home. I wasn't there for that part. I didn't need to be. What I was there for, sitting quietly in a car Terence had arranged outside Bellwether's building, was what happened roughly 40 minutes later, when Damien called Serena in a full panic, and she in turn called me, still standing frozen in the lobby of that same building, her voice climbing into a register I had genuinely never heard from my own daughter in 30 years of knowing her. "Dad, what did you do?" she said the moment I picked up before I'd even had the chance to say hello. "There are federal agents here. Damien's lawyer is saying this is insane, that this can't possibly be real, that—" "Dad, are you even listening to me right now, or are you just going to stand there in silence like always?" "I'm listening," I said, and I meant it, in a way I hadn't fully listened to my own daughter in longer than I wanted to admit out loud to anyone, including myself. I drove to Bellwether's headquarters myself, arriving exactly as Terence had instructed, walking into that glass-walled lobby with a calm I hadn't felt walking anywhere in 14 full days. Terence was already there, waiting for me, standing near the elevator bank with a thick leather folder tucked under one arm, wearing the same steady, unreadable expression he'd worn at Marion's funeral 11 years earlier. The expression of a man who has already done every ounce of the difficult work in advance and is simply here now to calmly explain the results. Serena saw me first. She crossed that entire lobby faster than I had ever once seen her move, her face wet, her voice cracking apart before she'd even fully reached me. "Dad, please, you have to fix this. You have to tell them it's all a mistake. Tell them Damien didn't actually do anything wrong. Please, I'm begging you." "I'm not going to do that," I said quietly, holding her gaze, "because it isn't a mistake." Terence stepped forward then, and in the same measured, unhurried tone I imagined he used in courtrooms twice a month, he laid it all out plainly, In front of Damien, in front of Serena, in front of the two agents patiently waiting to escort Damien into a separate room for formal questioning. He explained that every asset once belonging to Leland Foss, the house in Westchester, the retirement accounts, the remaining equity stake in Bellwether Ventures itself, had been transferred into an irrevocable trust a full 9 days before the power of attorney was even signed. He explained that the signature on that document had been executed under a legally registered duress protocol, rendering it void from the exact instant of signing. He explained, finally, calmly, almost gently, that the document Damien had used to solicit a $3 million bridge loan from Highgate Ventures was, in the plain view of federal investigators, a fraudulent financial instrument, and that its use across state lines constituted wire fraud under federal statute, carrying real, documented consequences. "You're lying," Damien said, his voice shaking now, in a way it had never once shaken in that cabin, in that observation lounge, at that kitchen table 6 months earlier. "None of this is real." He signed it himself. "I have it in writing right here." "You have a document with no legal effect whatsoever," Terrence said evenly, "and a federal case file with your full name printed on it. I'd suggest you spend considerably less time arguing about the first thing and a great deal more time worrying about the second." Serena turned on me then, and I watched something cross her face I had never once seen directed at me in 30 years. Pure, undiluted panic. "What about the trust, Dad? What about me and all of this? I'm still your daughter, whatever he did. This is still supposed to be my inheritance, too." Terrence answered before I could, and I let him, because I had asked him to prepare exactly this moment days earlier by satellite phone, and because I no longer trusted my own voice to stay steady through it. "Ms. Foss," he said, using my daughter's maiden name deliberately, coldly, professionally, "in the most recently activated version of your father's trust and estate documents, your name has been permanently removed as a beneficiary. Your husband, meanwhile, is currently facing a federal charge that carries a potential sentence of up to 10 years in prison for defrauding a financial institution." I have never in my 62 years seen a human face collapse the way Serena's collapsed in that lobby, right there in front of strangers in business suits. She turned to me one final time, tears cutting clean lines down cheeks that still carried a trace of Rhine sunshine, and she asked me the only question she had left. "How could you do this to your own daughter?" I looked at her for a long moment before I answered, long enough that the entire lobby seemed to hold its breath around the two of us. "How could you do what you did to your own father?" I said, and then I turned, walked back out through the same glass doors I'd come in through, and got into the car waiting for me at the curb, leaving my daughter standing in that lobby with a federal case file, a husband being led away by 2 calm, unhurried agents, and a family she had quietly decided, weeks earlier, on a ship in the middle of the Rhine, wasn't worth keeping her own father inside of. The legal consequences took nearly 8 months to fully play out, and I want to tell you honestly, without any of the satisfaction you might expect from a man who supposedly won, that none of those 8 months felt like winning while I was actually living through them. Damien pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence, 4 years in a minimum security facility, and a restitution order that stripped him of every remaining asset Bellwether Ventures had ever touched. The company itself collapsed within weeks of the indictment, once word spread through the tight, gossiping world of venture capital that its founder had tried to leverage falsified collateral for a bridge loan. Highgate Ventures walked away clean. His investors walked away with nothing. His employees, the ones who'd stayed loyal through 18 months of missed bonuses, filed a separate civil suit for unpaid wages that I heard, secondhand, actually succeeded. Serena was never charged with anything. Overhearing a plan is not the same as executing one, Terrence explained to me carefully, and there was no evidence she had personally signed, sent, or profited from a single fraudulent document. But the trust was already activated, already irrevocable, already exactly what 4 days of frantic legal work on a moving ship had made it. She lost the apartment she and Damien had been renting in the city, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows I had helped cover the security deposit on. She lost the car. She lost, eventually, most of the friends who had only ever really been drawn to the version of Serena who could afford dinner at the restaurants they liked. I heard through a mutual acquaintance from her college years that she was working as a waitress at a diner off Route 9, the kind of place with laminated menus and bottomless coffee, 6 days a week, splitting a 2-bedroom apartment with a roommate to make rent. I did not celebrate that. I want to be very clear about that because I know how this story is supposed to end in the version people want to hear, with the villain thoroughly crushed and the hero standing triumphant over the wreckage. That isn't what it felt like. What it felt like most nights during those 8 months was sitting alone in my house, the house that legally belonged to a trust now, not to me, though I still had every right to live in it, staring at a wall of family photographs I had never once taken down, feeling a grief so total and so strange that I genuinely didn't have language for it. I had won. I had protected myself completely, exactly as I'd set out to do on that ship. And I had also, with my own 2 hands, ensured that my only child would spend her 30s working double shifts at a diner and splitting rent with a stranger. Both of those things were true at the same time. I have stopped waiting for that particular tension to resolve itself, because I don't think it ever fully will. It was a victory soaked, from the very first day, in a grief I never expected to still be carrying this far into it. What finally started to shift something inside me wasn't a court date or a settlement or even the day I heard through Terrence that Damien had officially surrendered himself at the federal facility upstate. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn, roughly 5 months into that long, quiet stretch of grieving a family that had turned out to be something other than what I believed, when I found myself, almost without deciding to, driving to the county animal shelter 20 minutes from my house. I hadn't planned it. I'd driven past that shelter probably 400 times in the years since Marion and I first moved into that house, and I had never once stopped. But that afternoon I pulled into the gravel lot, walked inside past a bored volunteer at the front desk, and found myself standing in front of a chain-link kennel holding an enormous, graying German shepherd who barely lifted his head to look at me. His name was Moose. The intake card taped to his kennel said he was 8 years old, surrendered by a family relocating overseas, who couldn't take him due to his age and medical needs. He had a slight limp in his back left leg, cloudy patches starting to form at the edges of both eyes, and a look about him, I don't know a better way to describe it, of an animal who had simply stopped expecting anything good to walk through that door. A volunteer told me quietly, almost apologetically, that dogs his age rarely got adopted at all, that most people came in wanting puppies, that Moose had been there longer than any other animal in the building. I sat down right there on the concrete floor outside his kennel in my good slacks, and I didn't say anything for a long time. Moose eventually got up, slow and stiff in that back leg, and walked over to the fence and pressed his big gray head against the chain link where my hand was resting. I understood, sitting there on that cold floor, exactly what I was looking at. 2 creatures, both of us considered too old, too much trouble, too inconvenient to keep around by the people who were supposed to want us. I signed the adoption paperwork 40 minutes later. Moose slept on the floor beside my bed that same night, and for the first time in 5 months, so did I. Actually sleep, all the way through until morning. Something about that dog cracked open a door in me that 8 months of legal victories never managed to touch. I started sleeping through the night. I started cooking real meals again instead of eating standing up at the kitchen counter. I started slowly letting myself feel proud of what I'd built and protected, instead of only guilty about what it had cost. Terrence, of all people, was the one who eventually said it to me plainly over lunch one afternoon. "Leland, you didn't destroy your family. You survived one that was already gone. There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel like one yet. I sold my remaining stake in what was left of Bellwether Ventures' liquidated assets, a formality, mostly, since the company itself no longer existed in any meaningful sense. And I sold 2 rental properties I'd held on to since my architecture days, properties I no longer had any real reason to manage from an empty house full of photographs I still hadn't taken down. Between the 2 sales, I had more liquid cash sitting in an account than I had ever had in one place in my entire life. More than enough for the retirement Marion and I had once sketched out together on a rented balcony overlooking a river I never fully got to share with her. I found the RV lot almost by accident, driving home from Moose's second vet appointment, and something about the enormous Class A motorhomes lined up in rows in the afternoon sun stopped me cold at a red light. I test drove one the following week. $400,000, 38 feet of steel and fiberglass with a full kitchen, a king bed, and a passenger seat exactly the right height for a large dog to comfortably rest his chin on the window ledge. Moose, given the chance, climbed into that passenger seat before I'd even finished signing the paperwork. And I remember laughing, actually laughing out loud, in an RV dealership parking lot, for the first time since before that text message at JFK. I packed that motorhome slowly, over the course of a week, the same deliberate way I once packed a suitcase for a river cruise that never went the way I'd planned. I brought 1 photo album with me and left the rest behind, closed up and stored, not thrown away, not destroyed. I am not, in the end, a man who believes in erasing 30 years of memory just because the ending turned out differently than I'd hoped. I arranged for a property management company to check the house every 2 weeks. I said goodbye to Terrence Bishop over one last dinner, where he told me, half joking, that I was the single strangest and most satisfying client of his entire 30-year career. I did not say goodbye to Serena. I still don't know, even now, whether that was the right choice or simply the only one I had the strength to make. Some doors, I've come to understand, don't need to be slammed shut. They just need to be left quietly ajar, in case a person ever finds their own way back through them on their own terms, having actually changed rather than simply having run out of other options. The morning I finally left Westchester for good, I drove that motorhome slowly down streets I'd lived on for 3 decades, past the elementary school where I used to pick Serena up every single Friday, past the hardware store where I'd bought lumber for a treehouse she outgrew within a single summer. None of it looked smaller or sadder than I expected. It just looked like the past, finally, instead of a wound I kept picking at every single day. The highway sign outside of Cleveland read Yellowstone, 1,100 miles, and Moose had his enormous gray head out the passenger window before we'd even fully merged onto the interstate, ears back, tongue out, entirely unbothered by the 8 years of his life that had led him to this exact seat beside this exact man. I drove with one hand loose on the wheel and the other resting on his back, feeling the low, comfortable weight of a dog who had finally, completely, stopped waiting to be given away again. We reached the overlook just outside the northern entrance to the park on our 4th evening on the road, and I pulled over without really deciding to, the way you pull over for something you already know, somewhere in your chest, you're going to remember for the rest of your life. I set up a folding camp chair on a ridge overlooking a valley that had absolutely nothing to do with real estate values or trust documents or federal case numbers, and I sat down with Moose settling heavily against my leg, his breathing slow and even beside me. The sun went down over that valley in layers of orange and deep purple. I genuinely don't think I had stopped to actually really look at, in longer than I could remember. I thought about Marion, the way I always do at sunset, and for the first time in longer than 8 months, thinking about her didn't come with a knot of guilt attached to it. I thought about Serena, too, the little girl on my shoulders at the county fair, the woman in the lobby with tears cutting clean lines down her face, and I let both versions of her exist in my memory at the same time, without needing to resolve them into a single tidy story. I had lost the only family I thought I had left. I want you to sit with that fact honestly, because I have had to sit with it every single day since. But somewhere on a ridge in Montana, with an old, unwanted dog leaning his full weight against my leg, and the sky burning slowly down toward night, I understood something I don't think I ever would have understood any other way. I hadn't actually lost my family on that cruise ship. I had simply, finally stopped paying for the privilege of being used by people who had already decided, long before that trip ever began, exactly how little I was worth to them. What I found instead, sitting on that ridge, with the whole sky on fire above me, was something I hadn't felt in longer than I could honestly measure. Not triumph, not even relief exactly, just a deep, settled, absolute peace. The kind that doesn't need anyone else's permission to exist, and the kind, I'm slowly learning, that was mine all along.